Tonight, dear listener, we're not stepping into grand halls of power or reenacting the rise and fall of empires. We're slipping quietly through the back doors of history, into the peculiar, the personal, and the downright bizarre corners of the American presidency. This isn't about foreign policy or cabinet appointments. It's about pet raccoons, phantom footsteps, and dentures made of something far stranger than wood. For every solemn portrait hung in the rotunda of the Capitol, there's a story that never made it into textbooks, tales of superstition, of secret surgeries, of poker games played with priceless china. These are the margins of presidential history, the footnotes that tell us more about the men who held power than any campaign speech ever could. Because behind the polished image and presidential seal lies something human, odd, endearing, flawed, and infinitely more interesting. Tonight, we will meet wrestlers and duelists, inventors and illusionists, men who believed in ghosts and others who vanished for surgery on a boat. We will tiptoe past the expected and pause at the peculiar, not to mock but to marvel. These stories remind us that history is not a cold collection of dates and decrees. It is lived, strange, and often far more colourful than we imagine. So let your shoulders drop. Let the noise of the day drift away. Picture a candle-lit room in a quiet house, shelves filled not just with laws and declarations, but oddities tucked between the lines. Picture, if you will, a great oak chair by a hearth, a stack of files labelled confidential, too strange for public release. And in that spirit, we begin, not with the usual salute to General Washington, father of the country and architect of a new republic. No, we begin with something smaller, something hidden behind a closed-lipped smile. The first oddity of the American presidency lies not in policy, but in the very mouth of the man who helped birth a nation. Let's open the first file. It reads, George Washington's teeth were never wooden. George Washington's teeth were not wooden. We begin not with Washington the general or Washington the president, but with Washington the man who winced when he chewed. For centuries, school children were told that George Washington had wooden teeth. It's a myth so deeply woven into the fabric of American folklore that it has taken on the feel of fact. But the truth, as it often is stranger, more uncomfortable, and far more human. George Washington never had wooden teeth, not once, not ever. Instead, his dentures were a mix of materials that reflected the best and worst of 18th-century dental technology. Ivory from hippopotamuses and walruses, gold springs and brass screws, and, more disturbingly, human teeth, some purchased, some possibly extracted from enslaved people. These weren't teeth for smiling, they were tools for survival in a world where dental pain could be unbearable, where dentistry was still more art than science, and where the simple act of eating could become a daily ordeal. Washington's dental troubles began in his 20s. By the time he took the oath of office in 1789, he had only one natural tooth left. His letters and personal diary entries often reference dental appointments, abscesses, and his increasingly desperate efforts to find relief. He wrote of swelling and aching, of poorly fitted dentures that caused his lips to bulge awkwardly, making speech difficult and painful. Even his famously stiff and formal demeanour, his tightly held expression in portraits, wasn't just a display of aristocratic restraint, it was practical. Smiling would have exposed poorly fitted false teeth or gaps that he preferred to hide. The dentures themselves were marvels of their time, custom-carved ivory bases, connected by metal springs that forced the jaws open unless the wearer clenched to keep them shut. Imagine trying to speak, to eat, or to hold court as a head of state, all while managing that contraption. It's no wonder that Washington was often reserved, aloof, and slow to speak. Physical pain shaped his character just as much as military experience or moral principle. One of his most trusted dentists, Dr. John Greenwood, kept meticulous records of the president's many dental issues. In one letter, Greenwood admitted that he had even inserted real human teeth into the denture sets. In an era when enslaved people were often forced to surrender their teeth for this purpose, the moral implications linger, a shadow cast upon a founding father's smile. The myth of wooden teeth likely arose from the staining and cracking of the ivory and metal, which could take on a wood-like appearance over time. Add to that the generations of simplified storytelling in classrooms, and a myth was born. Easier to say wooden than to explain a complicated truth. But the reality is a window into Washington's private struggles, a reminder that even the most iconic figures carry burdens unseen by the public eye. And so, as you lie back tonight, consider the quiet pain of a man trying to lead a newborn nation while dealing with something so basic, so human as toothache. Picture him at Mount Vernon after a long day of correspondence and hosting foreign dignitaries, slipping off his dentures with a sigh of relief. The weight of the nation rested on his shoulders, and in his mouth a daily reminder that even legends chew through discomfort. Sleep now with the gentle truth that even first presidents had flaws, not of character, but of cartilage and calcium. And sometimes it's those tiny, almost forgotten facts that bring us closest to the men behind the monuments. Dentistry in the 18th century was, in many ways, a blend of desperation and guesswork, more a craft than a science, and rarely gentle. There were no anesthesia, no antibiotics, and very little understanding of oral hygiene. Tools resembled something closer to blacksmithing equipment than medical instruments. Extractions were often brutal, performed with forceps or a tooth key, which twisted the tooth out with a horrifying crunch. Dental care was largely reactive, not preventive. By the time someone sought a dentist, the pain had already become unbearable. George Washington's lifetime happened to coincide with this era of crude experimentation. He consulted numerous dentists, from itinerant tooth pullers to educated professionals like Dr. John Greenwood, but even Greenwood, who crafted some of the most advanced dentures of his time, was limited by the constraints of his tools and materials. The best solutions involved ivory and animal bone carved to fit over inflamed gums, held together with metal springs that could break or loosen at any moment. The idea of comfort was secondary to mere function. Washington's pain was chronic and intrusive. He suffered from gum inflammation, recurring abscesses, and persistent jaw discomfort. Several of his personal letters include references to swelling and difficulty eating or speaking. In one, he mentions being unable to dine comfortably because his dentures had misaligned again. In another, he complains of facial swelling severe enough to prevent him from addressing guests properly. These weren't isolated incidents. They were a daily rhythm of discomfort that colored every interaction, every state dinner, every formal address, and this discomfort shaped the man. Washington's famously stern and reserved public demeanor may not have been entirely a matter of personality or choice. The strain of constantly managing physical pain, particularly pain that affected the very way he spoke and smiled, likely contributed to his stoic expression and deliberate cadence. He was known to be slow to speak, careful with words, and measured in expression. Some contemporaries described him as aloof or overly formal, but those perceptions may have been the result of someone simply trying not to grimace. The portraits of Washington tell part of this story too. Rarely do we see a broad grin or open-lipped expression. Artists often painted him with tight lips, a clenched jaw, and a kind of marble stillness. Behind that artistic choice was reality. Washington's dentures often did not fit well. They would shift, rattle, or bulge under the strain of talking too long. Smiling too wide risked revealing the metal and ivory framework beneath. It wasn't just about dignity, it was about control, concealment, and coping. Some historians suggest that Washington's discomfort also influenced his temperament during key moments of his presidency. His reluctance to engage in extended debates, his preference for brief public appearances, and his tendency to delegate direct communication to others all may have been partially driven by the simple fact that talking hurt. He was balancing the immense pressures of leading a fragile young nation with the persistent distraction of oral pain. And yet through all of this he maintained his composure, his sense of duty, and his quiet command. As the father of a nation, Washington has often been mythologized, cast in marble and bronze, his image stamped onto currency and monuments. But behind that enduring symbol was a man, one who understood pain intimately. A man who winced when he bit into food, who had to pause before speaking, and who bore the burden of both a new republic and a ruined jaw. So tonight, as you close your eyes, remember this softer truth. The greatness of Washington was not in his perfection, but in his perseverance. His leadership was not born in comfort, but in the quiet endurance of daily pain. Let that thought settle gently over you. A reminder that history is shaped not just by battles and speeches, but by the unseen, personal struggles of those who lived it. Sleep now, knowing that even the strongest among us carried unseen burdens, and sometimes it's the smallest things, like a toothache, that reveal the greatest resilience. John Quincy Adams believed in a hollow earth. In the early 19th century, when the edges of science blurred with wonder and untested ideas roamed the minds of even the nation's most educated, there stood John Quincy Adams, diplomat, scholar, president, and, curiously, a man open to one of the strangest scientific theories of his time, that the earth was hollow and habitable inside. John Quincy Adams, the sixth President of the United States and son of the nation's second, is usually remembered for his sharp intellect and diplomatic legacy. Fluent in multiple languages, a voracious reader, and the mind behind many foreign policy doctrines, Adams seemed the epitome of Enlightenment rationality. Yet tucked within the folds of his presidential years lies a lesser-known episode, one that speaks more to the era's bold curiosity than to any lapse in judgment. Adams showed interest in a proposed government expedition to explore the interior of the Earth, which was then theorized by some to be hollow. The idea was championed by John Cleves Simms, Jr., a former army officer turned scientific eccentric who passionately believed that the Earth was not a solid sphere but a hollow shell with enormous openings at the poles. Simms theorized that these entrances led to a lush, habitable inner world, complete with flora, fauna, and possibly advanced civilizations. He lectured widely, printed circulars to members of Congress, and sought federal funding for an expedition to enter this hollow realm through the North Pole. While most lawmakers scoffed, Adams did not dismiss Simms outright. According to historical accounts, he met with Simms and listened seriously to the proposal. He reportedly considered it emblematic of America's scientific ambition, the same spirit that had led Lewis and Clark into the wilderness just a generation earlier. The Hollow Earth expedition never received government funding, and Adams left office before it could be pursued. His successor, Andrew Jackson, a more combative and skeptical man, promptly put an end to the idea. Why would such a learned man entertain what now seems a fantastical notion? In context, the answer lies not in gullibility, but in the intellectual environment of the age. The early 1800s were a time of scientific ferment, where the boundaries of fact and theory were still fluid. Geology was in its infancy. Dinosaurs had not yet been widely understood. The idea that the Earth might contain caverns or even entire inner worlds was still within the realm of possibility for thinkers eager to expand the nation's geographic and scientific horizons. Adams's willingness to consider Simmis's proposal may reflect his open-mindedness and the prevailing optimism of the post-Enlightenment world. He believed in exploration, in pushing the boundaries of what was known. To him, investigating strange ideas was not foolish, it was a mark of intellectual courage, and there's a poetic irony here. Adams, often portrayed as stiff and austere, harbored a spark of imaginative daring. The same man who negotiated treaties, penned philosophical letters, and argued before the Supreme Court in his later years on behalf of human rights, was also intrigued by the idea of vast caverns beneath our feet. The Hollow Earth story did not end with Adams. It passed into American folklore, feeding decades of pseudoscience, novels, and eventually science fiction. Jules Verne's Journey to the Center of the Earth and Edgar Rice Burroughs's Pellucidar series owe something to Simmis's wild theory, and while modern science has firmly closed the door on hollow Earth theories, the tale remains a curious footnote in the legacy of American presidents. In Adams, we glimpse a moment when leadership still flirted with the speculative, when even the most logical minds allowed space for wonder. His interest in the hollow earth wasn't a detour from his intellect, it was part of its breadth. It reminds us that not all strange beliefs are born of ignorance. Some are born of an era's unbounded hunger to explore the unknown. Andrew Jackson had a bullet in his chest for 40 years. Andrew Jackson was not the kind of man who avoided conflict. He didn't step aside in a fight. He didn't shrink from confrontation. And he certainly didn't hesitate to defend his honor, even if it meant standing 10 paces from another man with pistols raised. Jackson, the 7th President of the United States, is remembered as a fierce general, a populist president, and a controversial figure in American history. But behind the policies and political brawls was a man who carried a literal piece of violence inside him for most of his life. A bullet embedded deep in his chest, a permanent souvenir from a duel that nearly killed him and never fully healed. Jackson's life was peppered with conflict long before he reached the White House. Born in the Carolinas in 1767, he was orphaned during the American Revolutionary War and grew up with a hot temper, a sharp tongue, and an unwavering sense of personal honor. In the rugged frontier culture of the early Republic, disputes weren't always settled with words, and Jackson quickly developed a reputation for turning to dueling as a means of settling scores. By some estimates, Jackson participated in over a dozen duels, though not all of them ended in gunfire. Most duels were resolved through apologies or missed shots, acts of ritual rather than bloodshed. But not always. One of the most famous and consequential occurred in 1806. The opponent, Charles Dickinson, a talented marksman and a man who had insulted Jackson's wife Rachel by questioning the legality of their marriage, a deeply personal and inflammatory accusation. The duel was held in Logan County, Kentucky. Dickinson, confident in his aim, fired first. His bullet struck Jackson square in the chest, dangerously close to his heart. Remarkably, Jackson did not fall. Bleeding and badly wounded, he stood firm, took aim and fired back. His shot killed Dickinson. Jackson's friends and enemies alike were stunned. The bullet, doctors later determined, was lodged too close to Jackson's heart to remove safely. And so it remained, a constant reminder of that violent morning. It caused Jackson chronic pain for the rest of his life. He developed a persistent cough, occasional bouts of internal bleeding, and a rigid posture. At times he reportedly had trouble breathing, and some accounts say he would wheeze during speeches, but through all of it he pressed forward, as defiant and hard-edged as ever. And that duel with Dickinson was not the only time Jackson nearly died from gunfire. In fact, he carried not just one, but multiple bullets in his body. Another was from a separate brawl. He once said that he had been shot so many times he looked like a sieve. These injuries didn't deter him. If anything, they seemed to reinforce his myth. He became known as Old Hickory, a nickname given to him by soldiers who admired his toughness. Hickory wood, after all, was known for being one of the hardest in America. Jackson's passion for honor and his willingness to defend it with violence mirrored the honor culture of his time, especially in the American South. Duels weren't just expressions of ego, they were often seen as necessary social rituals for maintaining a man's reputation. But Jackson went further than most. His duel with Dickinson wasn't just about wounded pride. It was about defending the woman he loved and believed had been unjustly shamed. The fact that he was willing to stand and fire while bleeding from a near-fatal chest wound only cemented his larger-than-life image. And there were other duels, over gambling debts, political insults, even horse-racing disputes. One legend holds that Jackson once killed a man in a duel over a bet gone sour on a horse race, though details remain murky. What's clear is that Jackson carried the consequences of those violent encounters with him, not just in memory, but in his very body. When he eventually ascended to the presidency in 1829, Jackson brought that same combative spirit to Washington. He saw politics as another battlefield and his opponents as enemies to be bested. But beneath the presidential suits and the formal portraits, he remained the man with a bullet in his chest, a walking symbol of the raw, unpolished edge of early American life. Today we often think of presidents as polished statesmen, protected behind podiums and protocol. Jackson was something different, fierce, wounded, and determined to the end. The bullet never left his body, and he never forgot the duel that put it there. It is perhaps one of the most literal metaphors in presidential history. A leader who carried his battles within him long after the shots had been fired. Abraham Lincoln was a champion wrestler. When we think of Abraham Lincoln, we picture the solemn face on the penny, the towering figure who delivered the Gettysburg Address, the steady leader who held the Union together through Civil War. But long before the stovepipe hat and historic speeches, Lincoln earned a very different kind of reputation, not with eloquent words, but with grit, agility, and surprising physical prowess. In the dusty fields of frontier Illinois, Lincoln wasn't just known as a lawyer or a thinker. He was known as a fighter, specifically a wrestler who took on challenges from town to town and almost always won. Long before stepping into the White House, Lincoln stepped into makeshift wrestling rings, often no more than circles trampled into grass. By most historical accounts, Abraham Lincoln participated in over 300 wrestling matches during his young adult life, and remarkably, he was defeated only once. The sheer scale of his wrestling career is surprising, especially considering how rarely it's mentioned in formal histories. Yet in small Midwestern towns like New Salem, where Lincoln spent his formative years, his physical dominance was part of his local legend. Standing at 6 feet 4 inches tall, Lincoln was an imposing figure, especially for his time. He was lean, but incredibly strong, with long, sinewy limbs that gave him a massive reach advantage in wrestling matches. His wiry frame concealed a toughness forged by years of manual labor, rail splitting, farm work, hauling lumber. And unlike the scripted performances we might associate with modern pro wrestling, Lincoln's matches were gritty, informal, and often brutal. These were contests of balance, endurance, and clever technique, all of which Lincoln seemed to possess in spades. One of the most famous stories of Lincoln's wrestling days comes from his time in New Salem in the 1830s. At the age of 22, he was working as a store clerk when he caught the attention of a local gang known as the Clary's Grove Boys. These young men were known for challenging newcomers to wrestling matches as a sort of rite of passage. Their champion, Jack Armstrong, was a seasoned and muscular local fighter. When Armstrong challenged Lincoln, the match quickly drew a crowd. The details differ depending on the telling. Some say Lincoln threw Armstrong to the ground. Others suggest Armstrong backed off after realizing Lincoln was too strong to pin. What is consistent is that after the match, the Clary's Grove Boys, impressed by Lincoln's strength and calm under pressure, accepted him as one of their own. That moment marked a shift in Lincoln's social standing, not just physically, but as a man who earned respect without arrogance, who could win without humiliation, and who carried himself with dignity even in a brawl. But Lincoln didn't just stop with informal village scuffles. His wrestling reputation grew until, years later, he was posthumously inducted into the National Wrestling Hall of Fame. In fact, they include him in their official Hall of Fame biography, honoring him not just for his record, but for how he embodied the spirit of the sport: resilience, fairness, and toughness. There's another tale, more colorful, that Lincoln once stood before a group of men who doubted his strength and challenged any of them to fight him, one at a time or all at once. While historians debate the literal truth of that anecdote, it reflects how Lincoln's reputation had grown. He was seen not only as a man of principle, but as someone you did not want to provoke. Interestingly, Lincoln's wrestling legacy ties neatly into the persona he carried into politics. He was confident but not boastful. He could be rough and direct, but always with a foundation of integrity. He understood how to handle aggression without losing control, a quality that would serve him well in the tumultuous political arena of the 1850s and 1860s. Even as president, the memory of his physicality never fully faded. Political cartoons sometimes depicted him as a brawler, ready to wrestle the Confederacy or grapple with Congress. His tall frame, so often slouched in photos due to the burden of leadership, once moved like a panther on the fields of Illinois. In today's polished world of politics, it's hard to imagine a president with such a reputation for physical combat. But Lincoln wasn't a polished man by nature. He was self-taught, self-made, and self-assured. His wrestling matches weren't just youthful bravado, they were part of a larger narrative, a man tested by hardship, defined by resilience, and unafraid to stand his ground. So next time you see his face on a coin, remember, behind that stoic gaze is the memory of a wrestler, a young man who once took on all comers and walked away almost always victorious. Calvin Coolidge had a pet raccoon at the White House. When most people picture life in the White House, they think of polished halls, state dinners, and presidential portraits. But during the 1920s, under the quiet and often misunderstood leadership of President Calvin Coolidge, the White House was not only the seat of American power, it was also something of a zoo. At the heart of this unlikely menagerie was a most peculiar first pet, a raccoon named Rebecca. Rebecca didn't arrive at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue by accident. In fact, she was originally sent to the Coolidge family as a Thanksgiving offering, meant quite literally to be cooked and served at the holiday dinner table. Raccoon meat, while uncommon, was still consumed in certain parts of the country at the time, and this raccoon was a gift from a supporter in Mississippi. But when the Coolidges received her, they found the idea of eating her distasteful. Instead of preparing her for dinner, they adopted her as part of the family. President Coolidge and First Lady Grace Coolidge quickly grew fond of Rebecca. She was given a collar, leash, and free rein of the White House grounds. She had a peculiar way of navigating the residence, often climbing curtains or curling up in unexpected places. Visitors would sometimes catch a glimpse of Rebecca lounging in a sunbeam or padding alongside staff in the corridors. Grace Coolidge once described her as an intelligent, curious, and affectionate creature, though she also admitted Rebecca could be a bit mischievous, stealing shiny objects and overturning flower vases. Rebecca's antics didn't stop there. She was even brought to events and photographed with the president, earning a kind of celebrity status in her own right. During the 1927 Easter egg roll, she was spotted wearing a ribbon and being led by the First Lady through a crowd of delighted children. Newspapers of the day loved the novelty and frequently ran stories about the Coolidge's unusual pet. It was perhaps a lighter story in an era marked by prohibition, labor unrest, and post-war economic shifts, but Rebecca wasn't alone. The Coolidges, it turned out, had a deep affection for animals, so much so that their collection rivaled that of a small zoo. Over the course of Coolidge's presidency, the White House grounds played host to a wild array of creatures: a wallaby, a pygmy hippopotamus, a gift from Liberia, a duiker, a small antelope, lion cubs, a bobcat, a goose, a donkey, a bear, and even a pair of caged raccoons in addition to Rebecca. At one point, they even housed a black swan. Each animal had its own story and place in the presidential ecosystem, but none captured the public's attention quite like Rebecca. She accompanied the Coolidges on car rides, wandered into official meetings, and even had a custom-built treehouse outside for fresh air and climbing. Her presence was so beloved that when the Coolidges took their winter trips to South Dakota, Rebecca was brought along on the train, complete with her own seat and care instructions. Despite her popularity, Rebecca's behavior did have limits. Like many wild animals, she could be unpredictable, and after a few years it became clear that life in the White House might not be sustainable for her in the long term. Eventually, she was relocated to the Rock Creek Park Zoo in Washington, D.C., where she could live in a more appropriate environment. Even so, her legacy remained firmly attached to Coolidge's time in office. Today, the story of Rebecca the raccoon seems almost unbelievable, a footnote from a time when presidential life was less curated and more eccentric. Calvin Coolidge, often remembered for his reserved and taciturn demeanor, showed a more whimsical side through his fondness for animals. While he may not have delivered fiery speeches or stirred the nation with grand visions, his quiet affection for creatures big and small offers a glimpse into the personal life of a man who otherwise kept much to himself. So, as you settle in for the night, picture Rebecca, the raccoon who roamed the halls of power, napped in sunlit windows, and reminded everyone, even for a moment, that the presidency isn't just about policy and protocol. Sometimes it's about kindness in unexpected places. Lyndon B. Johnson conducted meetings from the bathroom. When most people imagine the presidency, they picture a commander-in-chief seated behind the resolute desk, a flag draped proudly in the background, and decorum presiding over every interaction. Lyndon B. Johnson, 36th President of the United States, had a slightly different idea. For LBJ, there was no room too sacred for business, no moment too private for politics. In fact, one of his most defining habits was also one of the most bizarre, conducting meetings from the bathroom. Johnson was a man of extremes. Towering at over 6 feet 3 inches, he possessed an outsized presence that matched his physical stature. His aides, staff, and political rivals alike would come to know a style of communication that was less about dialogue and more about domination, a style that would later be famously coined the Johnson treatment. It involved standing uncomfortably close, poking chests with his large fingers, invading personal space and speaking with such bluntness and force that even the most seasoned politicians could find themselves overwhelmed. But perhaps the most unforgettable and deeply unconventional extension of this treatment was his habit of leaving the bathroom door wide open while conducting business, whether it was staff briefings, calls with senators, or updates from advisers. Johnson saw no reason to pause the flow of work just because he had entered the restroom. Sitting on the toilet, pants around his ankles, he would gesture, instruct, and grill staff as if it were any other venue in the West Wing. According to multiple accounts, aides would be forced to stand just outside or beside him, taking notes while trying to avoid eye contact. One particularly famous anecdote even describes LBJ yelling instructions over the sound of flushing water, an auditory punctuation mark to his dominance. Why did he do this? Part of it was pragmatism. Johnson believed in maximizing every minute of his day, but another part was deliberate theater, a tactic to unsettle and unnerve, to test loyalty and assert dominance. His openness about bodily functions wasn't just eccentricity, it was power. By violating norms others respected, he subtly reminded everyone in his orbit that he played by different rules, and they had to adjust accordingly. This approach wasn't limited to the toilet. LBJ was known to hold meetings while nude in his private quarters or while having his hair cut, barking policy decisions mid-trim. He even had a telephone installed in his bathroom so he could place or receive calls from the toilet. This wasn't just a novelty, it was a presidential fixture. Staff had to be ready, always. Perhaps the most infamous bathroom story involves a press interaction. While it wasn't a formal press conference in the classic sense, Johnson reportedly continued speaking to reporters and aides while relieving himself, unfazed by the journalists' discomfort. This deliberate blurring of private and public space became part of his identity, raw, unfiltered, and unapologetically Texan. It's easy to dismiss these stories as crude or merely humorous, but they tell us something deeper about Johnson's political philosophy. He believed that leadership wasn't about elegance, it was about effectiveness. If a bit of shock, discomfort, or bathroom diplomacy helped him push legislation or dominate a conversation, then it was worth it. And in many ways, this approach worked. LBJ passed more landmark legislation than most presidents before or after him. The Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, Medicare, Medicaid, he bulldozed opposition with the same intensity he brought to his restroom meetings. At the same time, his methods were not without criticism. Some saw them as bullying, others as a symptom of deep insecurity. But whatever the interpretation, no one who worked with Johnson forgot him. His presence was unforgettable, and so were his tactics. So as you rest tonight, let your mind wander not just through the marble halls of the White House, but into its lesser-known corners, places where power sometimes sat, quite literally. In Lyndon B. Johnson's America, even the bathroom was part of the political arena. Richard Nixon's secret plan for the moon. The summer of 1969 is remembered for a singular moment in human history, the Apollo 11 moon landing. Neil Armstrong's quiet words, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind," echoed across television sets around the world, cementing America's dominance in the space race. But what history often forgets is that just behind the triumph stood a shadow, a speech prepared for unimaginable tragedy. A speech President Richard Nixon hoped he would never have to read. Titled "In Event of Moon Disaster," the document was drafted by Nixon's speechwriter, William Safire. It was composed not for a successful return, but for the grim possibility that Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin might become stranded on the moon, unable to lift off and doomed to die on the surface of another world. The mission's complexity left many ways for things to go wrong, from malfunctioning equipment to misfired launch sequences. And so, in the interest of preparedness, the White House planned for the worst. The speech began with somber elegance. "Fate has ordained that the men who went to the moon to explore in peace will stay on the moon to rest in peace." It was meant to be read from the Oval Office, just as the world came to terms with the loss of 2 astronauts whose footsteps would have been their last. The statement continued by honoring the sacrifice made by Armstrong and Aldrin, suggesting that their courage would inspire future generations, even if they never returned home. It captured both a nation's grief and the raw, poetic awe of humankind reaching beyond Earth and paying the ultimate price for it. Equally chilling were the logistics surrounding the speech. According to Safire, in the event of failure, Nixon would have first called the astronauts' widows-to-be. Then, the White House would have cut communication with the lunar module, letting the astronauts speak their last words privately. NASA had protocols in place for such an eventuality, including advising the men on how to die with dignity and how to shut off their life support systems once hope was lost. And then, after the line went silent, Nixon would have gone on live television to deliver the speech. The president, the nation, the world would mourn, but that moment never came. The lunar module lifted off. Armstrong and Aldrin returned safely. The prepared statement remained in a file cabinet, a relic of what might have been. Today it's preserved in the National Archives, a haunting reminder that even our greatest achievements are edged with risk. The existence of this unused speech speaks volumes about leadership at the highest levels, the readiness to face not just celebration, but catastrophe. It also reveals something profound about how we process the fragility of ambition. Behind every mission patch and countdown clock lies a quiet acceptance that history can go in either direction. As you lay back tonight, eyes closed, breathing steady, imagine the contrast, the jubilant cheers in Houston versus the silence of a speech never spoken. In some alternate timeline, it was the echo of Nixon's somber voice, not Armstrong's step, that marked the moon. But here in our world, the astronauts came home, and the speech remained, only a ghost of what could have been. Jimmy Carter reported a UFO sighting. It was 1969, and Jimmy Carter, not yet governor, not yet president, was standing outside a small gathering in Leary, Georgia, preparing for a Lions Club meeting. The evening sky stretched overhead in its usual hush, speckled with the quiet constellations of a southern night. Then something unusual appeared. Carter would later describe it as a bright, glowing object, roughly as luminous as the moon, hovering in the sky for around 10 minutes before vanishing. It didn't make a sound. It changed color from white to blue to red and then back again, and moved in a way that didn't resemble any aircraft he had ever seen. He was with a group of people. They all saw it, and none of them could explain it. In 1973, 4 years after the event, Carter, now governor of Georgia, filed an official report with the International UFO Bureau in Oklahoma City. He included the location, time, conditions, and the number of witnesses. It was a rare thing for a public figure of his stature to do, especially without any clear political benefit. But Carter, trained as a naval officer and nuclear engineer, was not the type to dismiss the unexplained without proper documentation. When he ran for president in 1976, Carter's sighting became a topic of interest. Unlike many politicians who might downplay or ignore such a story, Carter leaned into it, at least partly. He promised that, if elected, he would work toward greater government transparency on the subject of unidentified flying objects. He believed that the American people had a right to know what their government knew and what it didn't. This pledge struck a chord. The 1970s were fertile ground for speculation. Public imagination was inflamed by stories of strange lights, unexplained encounters, and government secrecy. And now, here was a future president saying he too had seen something mysterious, and that he would help lift the veil. However, once Carter entered office, he encountered the weight of classified information and national security constraints. His promise for UFO transparency clashed with the reality of intelligence protocols. Reports were tied to military operations, reconnaissance projects, and Cold War technologies. And so, while Carter maintained that he believed in disclosure where possible, many documents remained sealed. In later years, Carter walked back the certainty of the event. He said that he believed what he saw was likely a military aircraft, perhaps from a nearby base, an experimental design that wasn't public knowledge at the time. But even with that explanation, the image lingers. A future president standing beneath an unfamiliar sky, quietly awed by a strange light. Ufologists still cite Carter's sighting as one of the most credible on record, not because of the object's nature, but because of who saw it. A man of science, a man of faith, a man who would go on to hold the highest office in the land. His sincerity gave the story weight. It wasn't the first time a U.S. leader would be linked to unexplained aerial phenomena, but it was one of the most openly acknowledged. Tonight, as you settle in, think of that calm Georgia evening. The Lions Club gathering, the hush in the air, and the cluster of people looking up together in silence. Wonder, after all, is not partisan. Curiosity doesn't require clearance. And even presidents, perhaps especially presidents, are allowed moments of mystery. Not everything needs an answer before morning. Ronald Reagan was briefly considered for the role of president in the day the earth stood still. Long before he was the 40th president of the United States, Ronald Reagan stood beneath the lights of a film set, reciting lines instead of policy. For much of the 1940s and early 1950s, Reagan was a familiar face in Hollywood, not a superstar, but a solid leading man. His screen presence was affable, his delivery confident, and his characters often represented a certain Midwestern honesty that audiences found comforting. Among the many roles that came and went during that time, one nearly had him face off with something far more exotic than Nazis or gangsters, a visitor from the stars. In the early casting drafts of The Day the Earth Stood Still, the now iconic 1951 science fiction film about an alien emissary named Klaatu, Ronald Reagan was reportedly floated as a potential choice to play the US president or even the lead. The idea, perhaps, was that his calm demeanor could lend credibility to a storyline that demanded a suspension of disbelief. Ultimately, the role went to others. The alien Klaatu was portrayed by Michael Rennie, and the film's human elements were led by Patricia Neal and Hugh Marlowe. But the script's themes, global unity, distrust of military aggression, and the haunting possibility of human self-destruction, would follow Reagan in a different form decades later. Because by the 1980s, Reagan was no longer imagining world-ending threats on film. He was facing real ones in the Situation Room. And yet, Reagan never seemed to fully abandon his Hollywood instincts or his affection for science fiction. In 1985, during a private meeting with Mikhail Gorbachev in Geneva, Reagan casually remarked, "What if all the world were to face an alien threat from outside this planet?" He continued, wondering aloud whether the United States and the Soviet Union might find common cause if Earth faced a threat from beyond. Gorbachev later confirmed the conversation in interviews, chuckling at the oddness of the moment and acknowledging the truth beneath the hypothetical. Reagan wasn't necessarily talking about little green men. He was using the language of fiction to suggest a path toward peace. If an external threat could dissolve ideological barriers, why couldn't internal wisdom do the same? Reagan would return to the theme more than once, even mentioning it in a United Nations address. For him, science fiction was more than escape, it was metaphor. In a time of nuclear standoffs and missile defense systems, the idea of uniting against a common enemy, even an imaginary one, had political resonance. Of course, Reagan's references weren't always taken seriously. Critics saw them as flights of fancy or evidence of a president too fond of narrative. Supporters saw them as clever reframing, turning fear into dialogue, turning cinema into soft diplomacy. In the end, he never played the role in The Day the Earth Stood Still. But in a way, he carried the spirit of the film into the real world. He imagined that peace might come not only through treaties but through stories, through the primal fear that something out there might find us, judge us, or even help us if we chose to help ourselves. So tonight, picture this: a young actor rehearsing in front of a mirror decades before stepping into the Oval Office. Picture the flicker of black and white film, the whir of a reel, and a man wondering whether fiction might someday become policy. In Reagan's story, perhaps the most bizarre fact is not that he was considered for a science fiction movie. It's that when he finally got to lead on the global stage, he didn't leave the script behind. Bill Clinton sent a presidential letter to a fictional TV character. In the early 2000s, millions of Americans tuned in every week to watch The West Wing, a political drama that offered an idealized, fast-talking version of life in the White House. It was sharp, emotional, and often deeply human, portraying the pressures of governance with sincerity and hope. And for many viewers, one character stood out above the rest. Leo McGarry, the gruff but loyal White House Chief of Staff, played by actor John Spencer. Leo wasn't real, but in the world of the West Wing, he felt like someone who could have been. He counseled President Josiah Bartlett with a blend of pragmatism and warmth. He battled addiction, grieved personal losses, and served with a kind of quiet patriotism that resonated across political lines. He was, in many ways, the heart of the show. So when John Spencer passed away in December 2005, shortly before the show's final season wrapped filming, it hit viewers hard. The producers made the decision to write Leo's death into the series, giving him a heartfelt exit during a pivotal presidential election plotline. The episode aired, the nation mourned. And then something unusual happened. Former President Bill Clinton, a known fan of the show, sent a personal letter of condolence not to the family of John Spencer, but to Leo McGarry himself. Or rather, to the character through the actor. The gesture was as symbolic as it was surreal, a real president acknowledging the death of a fictional chief of staff as if it carried national weight. It was more than a fan tribute. Clinton, ever the media-savvy politician, understood the power of story. He knew that fiction, when crafted well, could leave an emotional impact that rivaled the headlines of real-world politics. Leo McGarry wasn't just a character. He represented what many Americans wanted from their government: competence, compassion, and resilience. Clinton's letter praised both Leo and John Spencer for embodying those values, and it was delivered quietly, without spectacle. It was, in essence, a moment where the presidency met pop culture, not in parody, but in empathy. This was not out of character for Clinton. Throughout his presidency, he embraced popular media in a way few presidents before him had. He played the saxophone on the Arsenio Hall show, appeared on MTV's Choose or Lose campaign, and often referenced books, films, and music in his public remarks. He understood that to lead was also to communicate, not just through policy speeches, but through symbols, stories, and the shared cultural fabric of the nation. The West Wing, for many, offered a version of the presidency that felt aspirational, and Clinton, watching from the sidelines after his own time in office, recognized the comfort it gave people, and the role that actors like Spencer played in building that comfort. The letter wasn't about confusing fact with fiction. It was about acknowledging the blurred line where television shapes how we understand leadership. It was about emotional truth, the kind that doesn't depend on whether something really happened, but whether it felt like it could have. So tonight, picture this: a handwritten note tucked inside an envelope with a presidential seal, a tribute not to a senator or a diplomat or a general, but to a man who never held office outside of a script. And yet, for millions, that script held meaning. Bill Clinton's odd little letter reminds us that sometimes our most enduring symbols of leadership don't come from history books, they come from the screen. And when a former president reaches across that divide to honor a fictional one, it says something very real about the power of storytelling in public life. Thomas Jefferson invented a secret decoding device. When we think of Thomas Jefferson, we often picture the statesman, the philosopher, the writer of the Declaration of Independence, a man with quill in hand and ideals on parchment. But beneath the powdered wigs and political speeches was something else entirely: a restless inventor, a tinkerer of tools and systems, with a mind drawn not just to liberty and law, but to gears, hinges, and secret codes. Among his lesser-known but most fascinating creations was something he called the wheel cipher. It looked unassuming at first, just a series of wooden discs arranged on a spindle, but each disc was engraved with the letters of the alphabet in a scrambled order. When spun into the correct configuration, the wheels could encrypt a message so completely that, without the right sequence, it was all gibberish. The device allowed for secure correspondence in an age where letters could be intercepted, read, or altered en route. With the cipher, two people who shared the same wheel configuration could send coded messages and decode them only with their matching device. It was an 18th century precursor to modern encryption, designed not in a laboratory or military bunker, but in Jefferson's own mind, surrounded by books, globes, and sketches of ideas waiting to be born. He never patented the wheel cipher. He likely didn't even consider it particularly groundbreaking at the time. Yet the concept was so durable that over a century later, the US Army would adopt a similar method for encoding field messages during World War II. The design was revived, and it worked. But Jefferson's curiosity didn't stop with codes. His home, Monticello, functioned as a kind of living laboratory, filled with mechanisms that made daily life just a little more efficient and a little more delightful. He invented a revolving bookstand that could hold 5 open volumes at once, ideal for a multilingual scholar who often read from several sources at a time. He engineered automatic double doors so that opening one would open the other, thanks to a system of pulleys and weights hidden in the floorboards. His dumbwaiter system allowed wine to be retrieved from the cellar without disturbing conversation upstairs, and the layout of Monticello itself followed mathematical symmetry, a house designed as a philosophical statement. Jefferson even tracked the wind, the temperature, and the movement of the sun, not just for agricultural purposes, but for the pleasure of knowing. In an age before light switches and thermostats, his windows and skylights were carefully placed to optimize natural light and ventilation. Monticello wasn't just a home, it was an idea, one made of brick, brass, and endless curiosity. This inventor's streak wasn't separate from his politics. In fact, it reflected his worldview, that a well-ordered mind should lead to a well-ordered society. That knowledge, when harnessed, could produce not only better governance, but better living. So as you rest tonight, imagine a president not hunched over documents of war, but gently spinning wooden wheels between his fingers, composing a letter in cipher, smiling at the thought of a message understood by only one other person in the world. Thomas Jefferson's gadgets may seem quaint now, even odd, but in their quiet way they reveal a deeper truth about leadership. That invention, curiosity, and the joy of solving problems are as much a part of a president's legacy as speeches and statues. In the coded messages, the clever hinges, and the revolving shelves, we glimpse a man who understood that genius can live in the margins, sometimes in the most unexpected designs. Martin Van Buren popularized the word okay. It's one of the most common expressions in the English language, brief, almost invisible in daily speech, but unmistakable in tone. Okay. We use it to agree, to acknowledge, to end conversations or begin them. But few realize that this tiny phrase, so ordinary now, carries an unexpected connection to a president. Martin Van Buren, the 8th President of the United States. Van Buren was born in Kinderhook, New York, a quiet village that earned him the affectionate nickname Old Kinderhook. During his 1840 re-election campaign, supporters began using OK as shorthand for their candidate, a slogan that was easy to print on posters, banners, and buttons. Vote for OK became a rallying cry, catchy and quick, a kind of proto-hashtag for a 19th century political movement. But Van Buren's campaign didn't invent OK. Its roots trace back to a trend of humorous misspellings in Boston newspapers during the 1830s. Writers would playfully abbreviate misspelled phrases like no-go as KG for no-go or all correct as OK for all correct. It was linguistic satire, a sort of inside joke for readers. The joke caught on, and then, thanks to Van Buren, it went national. Though Van Buren ultimately lost the 1840 election to William Henry Harrison, the expression stuck. OK travelled faster than the campaign that amplified it. It slipped into common speech, unchallenged by its odd spelling or comic origins, and gradually shed its political ties. The phrase's journey didn't end there. Over time, OK would become a global symbol, one of the few words understood across dozens of languages. It transcended borders and even entered telegraph codes, military lingo, aviation slang, and eventually computer systems. Long before emojis or check marks confirmed a message was received, there was OK. Martin Van Buren's presidency is often overshadowed by the economic turmoil of the Panic of 1837. His elegant fashion, meticulous grooming, and preference for formality earned him nicknames like the Little Magician and the Red Fox of Kinderhook. But his linguistic legacy, tied to the strange rise of two simple letters, has arguably endured far longer than his political one. Imagine that. A quiet, methodical man from a small New York town, inadvertently giving the world one of its most used expressions, not through policy or proclamation, but through the serendipity of politics meeting pop culture, in a time when slogans were still hand-painted and words still felt new. So tonight, as we pause on this peculiar presidential moment, let the story of OK remind us that sometimes the quirkiest legacies outlive the grandest ones. Presidents may shape laws and lead armies, but once in a while they also shape how we speak, in ways that echo in every casual nod, every text message, every quiet OK whispered before sleep. William Henry Harrison had the shortest presidency. He was a war hero, a frontiersman, and the oldest man ever elected president at the time. But William Henry Harrison's greatest claim to historical fame isn't a battle won or a law signed. It's that his presidency, as grand as the build-up had been, would last only 31 days, the shortest in American history. Harrison took office on March 4, 1841, under grey, bitter skies in Washington, D.C. It was Inauguration Day, and he was 68 years old, determined to prove that age would not slow him down. Eschewing a hat, gloves, or even a coat, Harrison stepped onto the Capitol steps in the freezing wind and proceeded to deliver a speech that still holds the record for the longest inaugural address in U.S. history, 8,445 words. It took nearly 2 hours to deliver, and by the end, the audience was frozen and fatigued. The content of his speech was classical, dense, and at times meandering, reflecting Harrison's desire to distance himself from the populist style of Andrew Jackson. But the moment that truly made history wasn't his oratory. It was the cold he likely contracted during that day, which soon turned into pneumonia. Just weeks after taking the oath, Harrison's health began to decline. He developed a persistent cough, then chills and abdominal discomfort. Medical practices of the era were limited and sometimes harmful. Treatments included bloodletting and opium, which only weakened him further. By April 4, 1841, exactly 1 month after assuming office, Harrison died. He became the first sitting president to die in office. His sudden death left the nation confused and unprepared. The Constitution was vague about presidential succession. Did Vice President John Tyler become the acting president, or was he now fully the president? Tyler asserted the latter, taking the oath and assuming full powers, setting a precedent that would hold until clarified much later. This unexpected event laid the groundwork for what would eventually become the 25th Amendment, ratified in 1967. That amendment formally established the procedure for replacing a president or vice president in cases of death, resignation, or incapacitation, a structure born from the confusion that Harrison's passing sparked. Though his presidency was brief, Harrison's life before office was full. He was famous for leading U.S. forces at the Battle of Tippecanoe, earning him the nickname Old Tippecanoe. His campaign used clever marketing, log cabins, hard cider barrels, and catchy slogans like Tippecanoe and Tyler too, appealing to the common man even though he hailed from a wealthy Virginia family. But in the end, it was not war or politics that marked his place in the presidential record books. It was weather, words, and a tragic twist of fate. A man who braved battlefields fell to a chill wind and a long speech, becoming a quiet footnote in executive history. So now, as we rest beneath calmer skies, the story of William Henry Harrison reminds us of fragility, that even the most powerful office can't shield one from nature's reach. Let this chapter close gently, as history often does, not with a roar, but with a soft breath lost in the wind. Franklin Pierce was arrested during his presidency. In the heart of 1853, just months into his presidency, Franklin Pierce found himself entangled in a scandal that blurred the line between accident, rumor, and political vulnerability. Unlike other presidential controversies that unfold behind closed doors or through policy missteps, this one happened in the open, on the bustling streets of Washington, D.C., and involved a horse-drawn carriage, an elderly pedestrian, and the arrest of a sitting president. According to reports, Pierce was driving his personal carriage through the Capitol when he allegedly struck and injured an elderly woman. Details of the incident remain vague, shrouded in the fog of 19th-century record-keeping and conflicting newspaper accounts. Some say the woman was merely brushed by the carriage, others suggest she was thrown to the ground. Regardless of the specifics, Pierce was briefly arrested, a remarkable event in presidential history. He was and remains one of the very few U.S. presidents ever arrested while in office. However, the arrest did not lead to prosecution. The case was swiftly dropped, reportedly due to lack of evidence and possibly due to Pierce's presidential status. The local police, perhaps out of deference or uncertainty over how to proceed with such a powerful figure, let the matter go quietly. The woman in question faded from the historical record, leaving behind only a ripple of public curiosity and a blotch on an already troubled presidency. Franklin Pierce's time in office was marked not just by unusual incidents, but by deep personal suffering. His term began under a heavy shadow. Just 2 months before his inauguration, his 11-year-old son Benjamin was killed in a gruesome train accident. Franklin and his wife Jane witnessed the event. The boy was thrown from the car and crushed before their eyes. It was their last surviving child. The trauma devastated both parents. Jane withdrew almost entirely from public life, writing mournful letters and interpreting the tragedy as divine punishment. Pierce, meanwhile, sank further into depression. It was during this time that Pierce's relationship with alcohol deepened. Even before the presidency, he had struggled with heavy drinking. As president, the pressures of office combined with profound grief seemed to intensify the habit. Though some contemporaries tried to shield him from accusations of alcoholism, others, including members of his own party, whispered about his frequent intoxication. Rumors swirled that his behavior, mood swings, and frequent absences from social engagements were linked not just to sorrow, but to the bottle. In political terms, Pierce's presidency was defined by increasing national division over slavery. His support for the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which allowed new territories to decide for themselves whether to allow slavery, inflamed tensions and set the stage for violent conflict. His hope for unity became, ironically, the spark that intensified disunion. He left office with low approval, rejected even by his own party when they denied him renomination for a second term. After his presidency, Pierce's decline continued. His wife passed away in 1863, and Pierce lived the remainder of his life in solitude, his health and reputation both deteriorating. When he died in 1869, few dignitaries attended his funeral, and his legacy was largely left out of national remembrance. And yet this small, strange episode, an arrest over a carriage accident, offers a unique lens into a presidency marked by grief, misunderstanding, and human frailty. In many ways, it reflects the man himself, present in power but shadowed by pain, never quite in control of the vehicle he was expected to steer. As we settle into quiet now, consider how the figures we place in the highest office are still deeply vulnerable to the very things that shape all lives: chance, grief, and the weight of memory. Ulysses S. Grant was fined for speeding on a horse. In the age before roaring engines and traffic lights, the streets of Washington, D.C. were a mix of clattering hooves, creaking carriage wheels, and the occasional startled pedestrian trying to sidestep a fast-moving team of horses. Amid this 19th-century bustle, a curious episode unfolded in 1872, one that would quietly earn President Ulysses S. Grant a peculiar place in history. He became the only sitting U.S. president to be arrested and fined for a traffic violation. It was a sunny day in the capital. Grant, known for his fondness for fast horses and skillful horsemanship, a talent he had demonstrated countless times during the Civil War, was out driving his horse-drawn carriage at a speed that, by 19th-century standards, raised some eyebrows and drew police attention. Local officer William H. West, a black patrolman who had served in the Union Army, stopped Grant and warned him about the dangers of speeding through the city. West reportedly told the president that other people had already been injured on the roads due to reckless carriage drivers. Grant, respectful and polite, acknowledged the warning and continued on. But the next day, to West's astonishment, the president was at it again, racing through the streets at breakneck speed in his carriage. West flagged him down once more, and this time, despite recognizing the nation's chief executive, he did something astonishing. He arrested him. It wasn't the dramatic kind of arrest that headlines are made of. There were no handcuffs, no scandalous crowd. Grant did not resist or protest. Instead, he reportedly smiled sheepishly and went along quietly. Taken to the station, he was fined $20, a not insignificant sum in those days, and rather than drive home, he walked. The incident might have faded into total obscurity were it not for Officer West's later recollections and the strange novelty of the story itself. What makes this episode so enduring isn't just the fact of the arrest, but the conduct of both men involved. Officer West, risking blowback for arresting the most powerful man in the country, stood firm in his duty. Grant, despite being a Civil War hero and president, submitted humbly to the rule of law, demonstrating a quiet respect for civic order that feels noteworthy even now. There were no claims of immunity, no accusations, no scandalous fallout. Just a fast horse, a good officer, and a president willing to admit he was wrong. Grant's fondness for horses was well documented. Even during the Civil War, his calmness under fire was often attributed to the way he rode, composed, unshaken, in control. After the war, he preferred to unwind with horseback rides and carriage drives, often taking to the streets at a pace that worried the more cautious residents of Washington. It wasn't recklessness exactly. More likely, it was the simple joy of speed, something he rarely experienced amid the burdens of presidency and national rebuilding. This speeding incident may seem trivial compared to the great battles Grant fought at Vicksburg or Appomattox, or the immense challenges of Reconstruction he tried to navigate during his presidency. But in a way, it offers an intimate glimpse into his character, a man of action, respectful of order and humble in his mistakes. Even while in power, he could admit fault and accept the consequences, no matter how minor or strange. So tonight, as you drift into rest, let this odd tale settle gently in your mind. The man who led armies and governed a wounded nation once paid a small fine for a swift horse, a reminder that even presidents are subject to the rules of the road. In the quiet hush of historical memory, it's often these little footnotes, not just wars and speeches, that humanize the great figures of the past. Grover Cleveland secretly disappeared for cancer surgery. In the summer of 1893, as the United States trembled beneath the weight of a devastating economic crisis, President Grover Cleveland quietly disappeared. There were no press briefings, no announcements, no dramatic motorcades. He simply vanished from the public eye. At a time when the country needed reassurance from its leader, Cleveland was aboard a private yacht on the East River, undergoing a highly secretive and dangerous surgery to remove a tumor from the roof of his mouth. This episode, hidden from the American public for more than 2 decades, is one of the most audacious acts of presidential secrecy in U.S. history, a medical conspiracy carried out with surgical precision, both literally and politically. The panic of 1893 was one of the worst financial downturns the United States had ever seen. Bank failures, collapsing railroads, and soaring unemployment rates defined the period. The very fabric of economic confidence was fraying. At such a fragile moment, any news suggesting that the president might be gravely ill could have sparked outright panic or further destabilized markets. So when Cleveland discovered he had a lesion on the roof of his mouth, later confirmed to be a malignant cancer, he and his advisors made a calculated decision. They would keep the diagnosis and the operation a secret. On July 1st, 1893, Cleveland boarded the yacht Oneida, owned by his friend and banker Elias Benedict, under the pretense of a fishing trip. But instead of casting lines into the Hudson, the vessel became an improvised operating theater. The ship's dining room was transformed into a sterile surgical suite. The operation would be performed in motion, with the yacht cruising the waters to prevent dockside suspicion. A team of 6 medical professionals, including a young surgeon named Dr. Joseph Bryant, conducted the surgery. Working under tight conditions, they removed a large portion of the president's upper left jaw and part of his palate. The goal was not only to eliminate the tumor, but also to preserve Cleveland's speech and appearance, vital for maintaining the illusion of good health once he returned to public life. Anesthesia was administered, the yacht kept steady, and the operation began. It lasted about 90 minutes. The doctors successfully removed the tumor, and Cleveland's face remained remarkably undistorted. A rubber prosthetic was later inserted to replace the missing tissue, allowing the president to speak normally, a crucial detail that kept suspicions at bay once he resumed public appearances. All those involved, doctors, crew, aides, were sworn to secrecy, and for the most part, the operation remained hidden from the public. In the following weeks, Cleveland convalesced in quiet, out of sight, with a carefully crafted narrative that he had simply been on a relaxing holiday. When he returned to Washington, his voice was slightly changed, but otherwise there were no outward signs that anything was amiss. A reporter named Elisha J. Edwards did catch wind of the truth and published a story about the surgery shortly afterward, but the article was dismissed and discredited by the administration. The full details wouldn't be confirmed until 1917, 24 years later, when one of the doctors involved finally broke his silence and recounted the entire episode in a professional medical journal. Cleveland's decision to keep the operation secret was driven by more than vanity. It was a strategic maneuver to shield the already fragile nation from more uncertainty. And while today such secrecy might be seen as undemocratic or evasive, at the time it was viewed by many in hindsight as a wise act of leadership under pressure. From a historical standpoint, the case also holds a unique place in the evolution of presidential health disclosures. In modern times, the public has come to expect transparency regarding the health of national leaders, but Cleveland's covert operation stands as a reminder that there was a time when personal ailments were seen as state secrets, when the physical condition of a president was considered too politically volatile to reveal. So, as you settle into your night, think of that quiet yacht drifting across the East River. Inside it, a president under anesthesia, surgeons working in silence, and the weight of a nation unknowingly held in their hands. It is one of those rare moments in history where medicine, politics, and secrecy collided on open water, and the operation that saved a man may have also preserved a presidency. Theodore Roosevelt had a bear cub and a badger in the White House. If you had wandered into the White House in the early 1900s, during the presidency of Theodore Roosevelt, you might have been greeted not by a stiff wave or ceremonial quiet, but by the lively clatter of hooves, claws, and paws. Roosevelt's tenure wasn't just a political saga, it was a zoological one. Behind the stately facade of America's most iconic residence lived a rotating cast of animals that more closely resembled the lineup of a traveling circus than the pets of a sitting president. Roosevelt, known for his booming voice, boundless energy, and rugged outdoorsmanship, had a deep affection for animals. This love was not a quiet one. It spilled enthusiastically into every corner of the White House, largely thanks to his children, especially his mischievous and energetic son, Quentin. At various times, the Roosevelt household was home to a bear cub, a badger, a macaw, guinea pigs, snakes, cats, dogs, a one-legged rooster, ponies, and even a lizard named Bill. Perhaps the most memorable of this menagerie was the badger named Josiah, who was gifted to the family during a train tour of the West by a young girl in Kansas. Roosevelt accepted the animal without hesitation and promptly brought it back to Washington, where it quickly became infamous for its sharp teeth and ill-tempered attitude. Josiah bit nearly everyone who tried to handle him, including several guests and staff. Still, he was adored by the Roosevelt children, who often took turns trying and failing to tame him. Then there was the bear cub, whose presence at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue is astonishing in hindsight. The cub lived on the White House grounds for a time before being sent to the Bronx Zoo as it outgrew its domestic confines. Alongside it roamed a small army of pets who were given the same free rein in the executive mansion as any child would be in their own home. The Roosevelt pets did not merely exist, they romped, causing scenes that, while chaotic, were undeniably endearing. Ponies reportedly were ridden through the White House corridors and dogs dashed across state rooms, sometimes interrupting official gatherings. This playful chaos found its way into the public imagination when, in 1902, Roosevelt famously refused to shoot a black bear that had been captured and tied to a tree during a Mississippi hunting trip. The bear was offered to him as an easy target, but Roosevelt, a committed sportsman, deemed it unsportsmanlike and spared its life. The incident was widely reported in the press and inspired political cartoonist Clifford Berryman to draw a whimsical image of Roosevelt and the bear. That cartoon caught the attention of a New York toy shop owner who created a stuffed bear in honor of the president's compassion and named it Teddy's Bear. The rest, as they say, is history. The teddy bear would go on to become one of the most iconic and enduring children's toys of all time. And though its legacy is tied to a single moment of mercy, it echoes the essence of Roosevelt's larger-than-life character. A man who, even as he charged headfirst into battles, political reform, and global diplomacy, never lost his capacity for warmth or whimsy. Roosevelt's White House was unlike any other before or since. It pulsed with the energy of a family unbound by protocol, a place where young feet pattered through halls lined with heads of state, and where animals napped beside the fireplaces where policy once burned. It was, in every sense, alive, a space where laughter and growls, diplomacy and chaos coexisted. As you drift deeper into sleep, imagine a president penning correspondence as a parrot squawks in the background, his children laughing as they chase a goat through the rose garden, and a badger sulking in the corner of a sunlit hallway. It's not the presidential image we learn in civics class, but in its chaos and charm, it tells us something more honest. That even in the most powerful house in the world, joy, curiosity, and the occasional animal bite can leave their mark on history. Warren G. Harding played poker with the White House china. There's something almost cinematic about Warren G. Harding's presidency, a heady mix of charm, scandal, and scenes that feel better suited to a saloon than the Oval Office. Among the more peculiar anecdotes from his time in office is a moment that speaks volumes about both his personality and the era he governed. The night he wagered and lost an official set of White House china in a poker game. Harding, the 29th President of the United States, was not a man of deep policy or sweeping reform, but he was undeniably personable. A former newspaper publisher from Ohio, Harding had the kind of easy charisma that played well on the front porch during his famous 1920 Front Porch Campaign. He projected warmth and accessibility, the kind of leader who made people feel they were in on the joke, even when the joke was on the government itself. But behind that genial grin was a man with an insatiable appetite for leisure. Poker wasn't just a hobby for Harding, it was nearly a ritual. Several nights a week, the White House would quietly transform into a gentleman's club of sorts, where smoke curled through the air, bourbon glasses clinked, and the stakes were apparently far from metaphorical. On one such night, with a full hand and plenty of confidence, Harding bet a priceless set of White House porcelain, china once selected to represent the dignity of the presidency. The cards turned against him, and just like that, a piece of national heritage passed to another poker player. No staffer intervened, no formal reprimand was issued. It was simply part of the culture Harding created, relaxed, personal, and deeply informal. Yet poker games and china sets are far from the most infamous elements of his presidency. Harding's administration became synonymous with scandal, particularly the notorious Teapot Dome scandal. At its core, it was a tale of corruption, the leasing of federal oil reserves to private companies in exchange for bribes. While Harding himself was never directly implicated, the scandal engulfed members of his cabinet, some of whom were close personal friends. It marked one of the greatest breaches of public trust in American political history up to that point and stained his legacy permanently. Still, It would be a mistake to view Harding only through the lens of corruption. He was, by many contemporary accounts, a man of contradictions, warm and jovial in person, yet overwhelmed by the job. He surrounded himself with friends rather than seasoned political operatives, many of whom exploited his trust. His presidency may have been light on legislative achievements, but it was full of human moments, and Harding, perhaps more than many presidents, revelled in the day-to-day pleasures of being alive. He adored vaudeville entertainment and frequently attended shows. He was a natural nicknamer, calling his friends things like Doc, Duke, or Jiggs. He loved to golf, play poker, and shoot the breeze in what some insiders called his little circle, a close-knit group of advisers and drinking buddies who blurred the line between friendship and influence. Then there were the letters, the kind that make archivists blush. Long after his death, a trove of passionate, handwritten letters surfaced between Harding and his mistress, Carrie Fulton Phillips, a family friend with whom he carried on a long and emotionally charged affair. The letters, filled with poetic flourishes, longing and intimate details, reveal a side of Harding the public never saw, vulnerable, romantic, even desperate at times. In one letter, he referred to his private anatomy as Jerry and penned lines so vivid that they are now kept under special archival protection. Harding's presidency, in hindsight, is often remembered more for its ambience than its accomplishments. A haze of cigars, laughter, bad judgment, and a man perhaps in over his head. But there's something oddly relatable in his story. A man who loved hard, played hard, and trusted perhaps too easily in a world too political for poker faces. So as you rest tonight, let your mind wander to a quiet evening in 1922. The White House is lit by low chandeliers. Glasses clink, cards shuffle, and the leader of the free world, sleeves rolled up, eyes on the flop, bets something he probably shouldn't. In that moment, history was not being written in speeches or treaties, but in a gamble, one porcelain plate at a time. Harry S. Truman believed the White House was haunted. For all the power it represents, the White House can be a lonely, even eerie place, especially after dark. Harry S. Truman, the 33rd President of the United States, knew this all too well. Though best remembered for making some of the most consequential decisions in American history, dropping the atomic bomb, recognizing Israel and desegregating the armed forces, Truman also harbored a more curious belief that the White House might be haunted. Truman wasn't a superstitious man by nature. He was grounded in small-town values and known for his blunt, no-nonsense approach to politics. But his time in the executive mansion introduced him to something no military briefing or congressional hearing had prepared him for: the unexplained creaks, footsteps, and knocks that echoed through the halls of the presidential residence after nightfall. The president took these incidents seriously enough to write about them, more than once, in personal letters to his beloved wife, Bess. On a quiet night in 1946, he wrote from the White House, "I sit here in this old house all the time and hear the floors pop and the drapes move back and forth. I can just imagine old Andy, Andrew Jackson, and Teddy Roosevelt having an argument over Franklin Roosevelt." In another letter, he recounted hearing knocks on his bedroom door at precisely 4 a.m. When he opened it, no one was there. Truman's staff occasionally reported similar stories: disembodied footsteps on the grand staircase, the sounds of pacing when the residence was empty, even the distant weeping of a woman. Some of the guards said they were hesitant to patrol the halls at night, particularly on the second floor. While Truman was clearly unsettled, he maintained a sense of humor about it. In a note to his wife, he jokingly speculated that ghosts might be responsible for the strange occurrences, suggesting it could be Lincoln, Jefferson, or other past presidents wandering the rooms they once occupied. He wrote, "The damned place is haunted, sure as shooting. It's been well known for years, and indeed tales of White House hauntings go back generations. Abraham Lincoln himself reportedly saw the ghost of his son Willie in the White House after the boy died of typhoid." Later, Queen Wilhelmina of the Netherlands claimed she heard knocking at her door while staying in the Lincoln bedroom, only to open it and see the tall figure of Lincoln in a top hat standing in the hallway. But it was under Truman that the idea of the haunted White House gained unusual credibility. Not only did he personally acknowledge the phenomenon, but it also occurred during a time when the building itself was undergoing massive renovation. In 1948, the structure was deemed unsafe, its wood beams rotting, the floors unstable. The Trumans temporarily moved across the street while the interior was gutted and rebuilt. During this time, workers dismantled walls and ceilings, perhaps disturbing more than just foundations. One theory posits that the ghostly noises Truman described could have been the natural groaning of an old house, one literally on the verge of collapse. Another interpretation, though, is more poetic, the spirits of history refusing to be silenced as their home was stripped down to its skeleton. Even if Truman never truly believed in phantoms, his observations reflected something deeper. The White House is more than a seat of power. It's a living monument, layered with memory, tragedy, and unresolved echoes of America's past. It's a house where decisions have altered the course of nations, where presidents have lived, grieved, and died. The creaks and whispers in the night are not just old wood contracting in the cold. They are reminders that history never really sleeps. And so, as you drift toward rest, imagine the quiet stillness of the White House long after midnight. Picture the halls dimly lit, the carpets muffling footsteps that have long since stopped. Perhaps Truman was right. Perhaps Lincoln still roams, or Jefferson lingers near the old state rooms, or perhaps it's simply the weight of history pressing against the silence. Either way, it's a comfort to know that even the most powerful leaders sometimes felt something watching, listening, remembering. Gerald Ford was a male model. Gerald R. Ford, the 38th President of the United States, is often remembered for his steady hand during a time of profound political upheaval. He assumed the presidency in 1974 after Richard Nixon's resignation, offering the country a quiet, if sometimes awkward, sense of normalcy. But before the Oval Office, before the Watergate aftermath, and long before he issued the controversial pardon that would define his legacy, Gerald Ford had graced a very different stage, the pages of glossy fashion magazines. It was the early 1940s, and Ford was a young law student with all-American looks and an athletic build. A former University of Michigan football star, he'd been voted the team's most valuable player and later turned down offers from both the Detroit Lions and the Green Bay Packers. Ford carried himself with a blend of discipline and clean-cut charm. That charm, it turned out, was not lost on talent scouts. While attending Yale Law School, Ford needed a way to make ends meet. Like many graduate students, he took up part-time work, but his side hustle wasn't shelving books at the library or tutoring undergrads. Instead, he was recruited by modeling agencies, including the prestigious Harry Conover Agency, to pose for fashion spreads and advertisements. Ford appeared in various publications, often as the archetype of the ideal American male, upright, thoughtful, square-jawed. One of his most notable modeling gigs was the cover of Cosmopolitan magazine in 1942. In the image, Ford wears a form-fitting V-neck sweater and strikes a pensive pose, his expression more serious than sultry. At the time, Cosmopolitan was still a general interest magazine, decades before its rebranding as a women's lifestyle publication, so Ford's appearance wasn't quite the pin-up fodder we might associate with modern celebrity modeling. Still, it was a striking moment. A future president featured not as a policymaker, but as a fashion icon. Ford also modeled alongside his then-girlfriend and future wife, Betty Bloomer. Betty, too, was immersed in the arts. Trained as a dancer under Martha Graham, she would later become one of the most beloved first ladies in American history. The two posed for department store ads in New York, presenting the image of a wholesome, aspirational couple. Their mutual involvement in modeling was a reflection of both necessity and opportunity, a way to stay afloat during tight times while embracing a bit of glamour on the side. Though Ford would eventually leave the world of posing behind, the photographs endure. They offer a fascinating glimpse into a man often remembered for his stoicism and clumsy image. He was frequently mocked on Saturday Night Live for his trips and stumbles, though in reality he was an agile athlete. The youthful images contrast sharply with the grey-suited politician who would later face the daunting task of restoring faith in the presidency. His modeling career is not merely a quirky footnote, it adds dimension to a leader who often seemed inscrutable. Ford didn't come from the aristocratic mold of a Kennedy or the Hollywood polish of a Reagan, yet for a brief moment he stepped into that world and wore it well. It's a reminder that presidents, too, have histories that stretch beyond politics. Strange gigs, unexpected detours, forgotten magazine covers. And in that way, Gerald Ford's modeling past fits perfectly among the oddities of presidential life. He didn't plan to be president. He was the only person to serve as both vice president and president without being elected to either office. His rise was unexpected, but his preparation was thorough, shaped by law, sports, war service, and yes, even a stint in front of the camera. As you settle into rest, imagine that iconic image. A young man in a wool sweater, shoulders square, gaze steady, unaware of the strange path that lay ahead. A man who posed for fashion ads to pay his way through law school and would one day lead a fractured nation toward healing. Sleep well, dear listener, even the highest office in the land has its runways and flashbulbs, flickers of humanity behind the weight of history. As we close the cover on these presidential oddities, let's take a quiet moment to remember that history, even when shaped by the most powerful hands, is never without its quirks. Presidents, the men whose decisions shaped economies, ended wars, launched rockets and signed bills into law, were also people who wrestled for fun, kept badges in the White House, wrote love letters, and sometimes even talked to ghosts. When we study presidents in textbooks, we tend to encounter the polished version, the suits, the speeches, the legislation. But tonight we've wandered through a softer lens. We've walked the hidden corridors of character, where George Washington's silent pain made him a stoic symbol, and Lyndon B. Johnson's open bathroom door revealed a peculiar display of dominance. We watched Calvin Coolidge leash a raccoon instead of roasting it, and we followed Jimmy Carter's eyes as they tracked something mysterious across the night sky. These aren't mere anecdotes, they are humanizing truths. What makes these stories so remarkable isn't their oddity alone, it's how they reveal something deeper than politics. In these quiet absurdities, we glimpse vulnerability, imagination, and play. The stuff that makes a leader more than just a role. A bear cub in the Roosevelt household says something about love and chaos. Nixon's unspoken speech for a moon disaster tells us about the weight of command. Gerald Ford modeling sweaters before law school reminds us that every president once stood at the edge of uncertainty, figuring things out like the rest of us. In these margins of power, there is a hidden kind of honesty. Not the speechwriter's version, not the campaign trail's polish, but the kind of truth that sneaks through in midnight letters, strange bets, or a long-forgotten word like okay becoming part of the national tongue. These are not mistakes or distractions, they are windows. Through them, we see how odd and beautiful the burden of leadership really is. So sleep now, listener. Let the raccoons and rockets, duels and decoding wheels fade gently into your dreams. Let the whispers of UFOs and the echoes of a president's laughter drift softly across your mind like wind over the National Mall. You have journeyed through the strange, the silly, and the striking. And in doing so, you've touched a gentler, more personal layer of American history, one where the extraordinary meets the absurd. Presidents, after all, are not just symbols, they are stories, and tonight you've heard the ones that rarely make the footnotes but linger just the same. Good night.